Militarily, I think we can defeat Iran probably in a matter of weeks. If we went in there with Israel, we'd probably defeat them in a matter of weeks. It's what comes afterwards.
Just like Iraq, just like Afghanistan.
And it's the unintended consequences. And the neoconservatives who are for war all the time, everywhere, they don't think through the consequences, the unintended consequences. So the unintended consequences in Afghanistan took 20 years. When we finally left, it reverted back to the Stone Ages within 6 months. We wasted $1 trillion in there. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have gone after our enemies there. We should have, but we should have come home 3 months later. And the same way here, what are the unintended consequences of this? Do they rush to the bomb? Do they have a nuclear weapon in 3 months?
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Senator Rand Paul, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Glad to be here. I heard it's a place to be.
Well, I appreciate that. I guess we'll start here. The United States has moved Nimitz carriers out of the Nimitz group out of the Pacific. It's moving towards Iran. The Israelis and the Iranians have been exchanging a lot of missile fire over the past few days. We are recording this Tuesday morning, so plenty of things are subject to change. But it seems like the United States is getting ever closer to being pulled into another Middle East war. How do you see this?
My hope is still that there's a route for diplomacy. I think President Trump's instincts are to try to keep us out of war. I think he has instincts within his belief system of restraint and less intervention. I think there are forces within his administration that would like to get us more involved. The real question is how is Iran going to respond to this? And this is the difficulty of foreign policy. We can say all the things we want. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want this. But it's how they will respond to being attacked. So they have been attacked by Israel, significant attack. Their scientists have been killed. Their higher echelon of military leaders have been killed. So do you think they'll come to the negotiating table or leave? I think it's more likely they'll leave than they'll stay. I hope there's still room for negotiation. But I think that right now, if you can imagine Iran, I would imagine they're humiliated because they've been really utterly decimated. I mean, Israel's shown incredible military prowess. They've killed people at will. They rule the skies. They've knocked out a lot of nuclear capacity, probably not all. But the question is, will Iran say, oh, well, that's just fine. Let's start the negotiations next week. Or will they be injured? Will they feel like they have to save face or that they have to show their strength? Will it bring together nationalism and their desire to resist? And I think that's the most likely response. And you think about when we've been attacked, what do? We rally around our flag. I'm not saying anything that they're for is good, but they will rally around their flag. They will rally around their own nationalism. And then the question is what happens? Does negotiation go by the wayside? So I think that's what we're facing right now. I don't think any easy answers. As far as their nuclear program, they could say, well, all right, we hear you and you bombed us and we don't like that. We're going to submit to your will. It will no longer enrich uranium. It won't do anything with nuclear power or possibly a nuclear bomb. Or they might respond by saying, we're going to commit the final steps to go ahead and have a weapon because the only thing that will keep you guys out of our country is to let you know we have a nuclear weapon. I don't know what the response is, and I don't think anybody knows what that response is, but quite a bit of their enrichment ability and their nuclear program is underground, deep underground, and probably was not affected by the Israeli raids.
So you bring up an excellent point, which is there are a lot of people cheerleading this intervention, cheerleading this war on social media, and they keep reiterating the president's line, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Right. I think a lot of us think that Iran having a nuclear weapon is not ideal. It is not a good situation, for sure. The question is whether or not this course of action taken unilaterally by the Israelis is going to lead us closer to ultimately the nuclear weapon or farther away from. Because if I'm the Ayatollah, which is a hilarious thought in the first place.
I'm imagining you with the big robes,
the big robes
long
and the beard, the beard that I can't grow. If I am the Ayatollah, I saw what happened to Gaddafi. I saw what happened to Saddam. I'm seeing what's happening right now, and I want to race towards that bomb. Do you think that the Iranians are more inclined to drop their nuclear program now, or do you think that in the future they're going to be going towards that bomb to get that stability?
See, I think that's the simplistic nature of the people who think they know that. I don't know the answer, but I think there's a reasonable argument that they may well race more towards the bomb than away from it. So, for example, a similar episode was the agreement. Now, there was an agreement under Biden to restrict enrichment. We had an Iranian agreement, the JCPOA. And then Trump took it out of us and put it into maximum pressure, more sanctions when we came out of it. But the Iranians' response was they were enriching to about 3 or 10%. They went up to 60%. When we pulled out of it, they pulled out of it and they accelerated their enrichment. So at least in that response, they did more to get themselves closer to a bomb than actually stopping their enrichment. The first agreement wasn't great. Probably should have released we released some of their resources. They'd made trades where some of their money was being held in escrow.
Right.
I think some of that could have been more, transitional, a little bit at a time, showing cooperation. The other failure of the previous Iran agreement was it was only about nuclear enrichment. It really need to be about their support of proxy war. I mean, they're as much of a menace or more than for all the different wars they're involved in the Middle East. And so I think any agreement with Iran has to be not just about nuclear weapons. It needs to be about ballistic weapons, and it needs to be about, they want the benefits of international trade. We'll welcome them back into the international community, but they got to, stay within their country boundaries and quit committing war and proxy wars throughout the Middle East.
Yeah, when I was a young intern on Capitol Hill, I went to a lecture with John Bolton, who is the Iran hawk, right?
Yeah.
But even he was saying, the type of deal that you want with Iran is similar to the JCPOA in its detail and its nature, but there were massive flaws, and I think flaws that people on the right reasonably pointed out. They first off, the hard water limitations that they were violating. That's a dangerous thing. You talked about the proxy wars. There were other limitations or incomplete limitations on their development of these missile capacities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that all needs to be part of a deal if we get this back to the table. At the same time, however, the goalposts are shifting on us constantly as this war, this Iran-Israel war continues on. At first, it was, this is Israel's problem. Don't worry about it, United States. You're not being called in. The United States acknowledges this unilateral action, et cetera, et cetera. Then it was, well, we will at some point need material support. Then it turned into, well, we need big old bunker busters to make sure that we can eliminate the nuclear program and continue to decapitate the regime. And now we have tankers flying over there. We've got the Nimitz group, as I said, going over to the region. It seems like this war that was supposedly just to go after the nuclear program is broadening to potentially a regime change war that could pull in American troops. I mean, what do you make of these shifting goalposts where people are still trying to say that this is just Israel's war? Can Israel fight this war alone?
Maybe. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that, but I do think that it's been simplistic to think that some kind of agreement between Iran and the U.S. is sort of the end all. They see Israel as a problem, which they're finding out is a real problem today and this week. But they also see Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms, the Sunni world, as adversaries at the very least. And so if you want some kind of peace agreement over there, I really think the peace agreement needs to involve all of the players as opposed to just the U.S. and Iran, because part of the reason Iran, you have to put yourself into the mindset of your adversary. It doesn't mean you're for your adversary or you condone what they think, but in Iran, they believe they are threatened by Israel. That turns out to be it is a real threat, and they believe they are also threatened by the Gulf Sheikdoms. So they have an elaborate missile program, probably better than their Air Force. Their Air Force, you haven't seen any plane in the air, so they're not even bothering to try to counteract Israel in the air. They can't do it. But they have a lot of missiles. They're just good at making missiles. And they make them as a deterrent and as a use response. But it's not just for us, and it really isn't for us. And none of them can really actually hit us. They can hit us over there, but they can't necessarily hit us here. And so they make these as a deterrent. You say, well, I want an agreement. I want them to reduce their ballistic missiles. They're going to say, well, what about Saudi Arabia? What about Israel? And this is the difficulty. They're going to say, well, we believe Israel to have 100 nuclear weapons, and you want us to have 0. How does that work? It's a problem we're having with China, too. We want to negotiate with China. China has a third as many nuclear weapons as we do. I think they'll negotiate with us when they get equal to us, but they're not going to negotiate to say, oh, we're happy to have a third of what you have in long-range weapons. But it makes it difficult, but it doesn't mean there still shouldn't be a discussion. But I think the more the better, and I think all the Arab world needs to be more involved. Sometimes we dominate the discussion. For example, Gaza, what happens when the war is finally over in Gaza, which hopefully we're getting close to? The rebuilding of Gaza, the Arabs need to be involved with that, and they need to be the people on the ground. There probably has to be some kind of police force in Gaza because there is no government. There are no buildings. There's no utilities. There's nothing from the pictures I've seen, there's nothing left of Gaza. In order for those people not to starve in mass numbers, you probably need some kind of police force, but they're not going to accept Israeli police force or American. I'm not suggesting I want American police force, but an Arab police force that would go in of 10 different Arab nations, but they need to step forward. We need to encourage more participation by the Arab world in the problems of the Middle East.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how all of the attention that was uber focused on Gaza has vanished in the blink of an eye.
Right.
And yet there are still various attacks on aid convoys, etc. There's a whole bunch of bad stuff still going on in Gaza, though we've been distracted by this larger conflict with Iran. Of course, we've heard time and time again from people who are supporting this, well, the reason that we need to do this, or the Israelis need to do this, is we need to prevent a nuclear Iran. We talked a little bit about whether or not this incentivizes Iran to go after the bomb, but I don't think those people saying that the reason we could potentially go in is because we need to prevent a nuclear Iran. Well, does that mean that you're comfortable with the Ayatollah remaining in power after this operation is done?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are saying that's not really the world that they want. And let's put this into context. A regime change in Iran. Iran is incredibly mountainous. The topography is impossible. It's a nation of 90 million people. It's Shia. There's not a lot of Shia majority countries. And so the 90 million population is equal to Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and Libya, pre-war populations all combined, plus another Afghanistan on top of that. I mean, should we be pushing these people to give us a clear vision of how they are going to, quote unquote, remake the Middle East?
Right. And I think what's important is, militarily, I think we can defeat Iran probably in a matter of weeks. If we went in there with Israel, we'd probably defeat them in a matter of weeks. It's what comes afterwards.
Just like Iraq, like Afghanistan.
And it's the unintended consequences. And the neoconservatives who are for war all the time, everywhere, they don't think through the consequences, the unintended consequences. So the unintended consequences in Afghanistan took 20 years. When we finally left, it reverted back to the Stone Ages within 6 months. We wasted $1 trillion in there. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have gone after our enemies there. We should have, but we should have come home 3 months later. It just the whole nation-building enterprise in Afghanistan was a huge mistake. In Iraq, we take out the main opposition to Iran. So by anybody's estimate, Iran is more of a problem regionally because Saddam Hussein's gone. And, it's those unintended consequences of what happens after the war. And the same way here, what are the unintended consequences of this? Do they rush to the bomb, or do they have a nuclear weapon in 3 months after the bombing attack, instead of them capitulating and say, oh, we're sorry, we're no longer going to try to pursue nuclear weapons?
You, of course, the great Ron Paul, very few people were speaking out against the war in Iraq when it happened. But you guys have been kind of on this vanguard of this resurgent anti-war right. President Trump differentiated himself in 2016, a race that you were in, by talking about foreign policy, immigration, and trade, going after the neocons, saying Iraq was a mistake. How has this anti-war right grown, evolved, changed? Where do you see it in the MAGA movement right now?
Well, I can think back to the American conservative cover with the Ron Paul moment sort of on it. And it was Ron Paul and Giuliani going back and forth. And at that time, my father was being booed by the crowd, I think, in South Carolina. And the resistance of the establishment and of the party, many of them didn't want the Ron Paul people in at all. They don't want these libertarians. They don't want any of these anti-war people in their party. But in many ways, he was successful in bringing a lot of young people and new people to the party. And now that's no longer an outlier position. I mean, Donald Trump, well, I don't think he's a libertarian, although he tells me all the time, I'm more libertarian than you are. But I don't believe that's probably true, Mr. President. But he does have some libertarian instincts. And he's the first Republican ever to go to the Libertarian Convention, for goodness sakes, and try to get votes there. But his instincts towards restraint, his instincts towards less war are libertarian leaning. I mean, look, for goodness sakes, you go back to Reagan and people are still trying to co-opt Reagan's mantle and Reagan's, what Reagan stood for. But part of Reagan was for less nuclear weapons. He signed the agreements with Gorbachev. He actually was part of a nuclear zero program as he left office. And he had a real profound fear of nuclear war that he wanted to do what he could as president to prevent that from happening. So even part of Reagan, Reagan came back from the Middle East.
He handled Beirut?
After the Beirut bombing, he comes back. So it was a part of Reagan that believed too much intervention was a problem. There's definitely a part of Trump. And I've been, with President Trump at Dover, seeing the soldiers come home, the soldiers who've been killed in action. Ugh. And it does emotionally affect him. And he, wants to know why we're, at the time, why are we still in Afghanistan? And he wanted to end that, and I think was getting closer and closer to that. And then finally, unfortunately, we had the, terrible withdrawal that Biden executed, just a terrible military blunder. But most of us at the point actually all said, it's time to come home.
Yeah, I saw that Afghanistan withdrawal. And, there's part of me that thinks maybe that was slightly better than a prolonged urban warfare in Kabul, where more and more Americans were put in danger. Even it's hard to even think about it going worse, and it's almost felt like weaponized incompetence against ending a war
it was just,
far away.
I'm not a military strategist, but leaving your last footprint from an urban Air Force or an urban airport with people, just tens of thousands of people trying to get on planes, was chaotic and a stupid way to do it. And our soldiers, 13 soldiers died because of that. They could have easily left from Bagram. It's protected by miles and miles of open desert, and they wouldn't have had that chaotic situation. And those 13 soldiers wouldn't have died. Mm-hmm. You put 13 soldiers in the middle of a mob, and that's not a good place for soldiers to be put.
You mentioned your conversations with the president when he says, I'm more libertarian than you. Good luck. But the conversations that you've had with President Trump recently about foreign policy, I know that he's been quite busy in the last few days, but how do you think he sees this? Where do you think this is going?
I think his instincts are for less war, and his instincts are not to get involved with bombing Iran. I don't know enough I'm not close enough to the situation to know whether or not the negotiations were in earnest or whether the negotiations were a ruse to put Iran at ease, during the bombing. If Iran sees it that way, there won't be much chance for negotiation. If they feel like they were tricked somehow into sort of becoming a little complacent through the negotiations and then they're bombed anyway, that's not a good lesson to send to anybody in the world, that if you negotiate with us, that it could be disingenuous and you could be bombed during the negotiations. If I had to predict, I think that's the conclusion Iran will take.
And if you were advising President Trump on what should be in an Iran deal, we mentioned it a little bit, but are there red lines that you were drawing, or what are you looking to see? I
think if you set too many preconceptions and too many red lines before you negotiate, you'll never get to the start. And what I liked about the president in the first term was when he talked to the dictator in North Korea. Everybody told him not to. All the neocons said, no, war, sir, is the only thing we can do. It was one of them, yeah. War's the only thing we can do. Everybody in the foreign policy establishment, Republican, Democrat, said don't do it. Now, it wasn't particularly successful other than this. I think it dialed the temperature down a little bit. And it gave the leader in North Korea prominence and fame that he craved to be an important player, and not the head of the hermit kingdom. So I think that helped in some ways, but it was Trump thinking outside the box. hopefully he will resist the calls of people wanting to bomb Tehran. We have the ability to do it. And that's the hard thing about power. We have the ability to do it. We can drop bunker busters on the facilities there. But then we're talking about the humiliation level will rise greater, and the idea of whether or not they will try to save face by something desperate, or whether or not it goes to street warfare, trench warfare, person to person, and they fight to the last person, or whether or not people rise up and take over the government. There's a lot of unknowns, and it could be, you'll be proclaimed a genius, and Israel will be lauded if all of a sudden there's an uprising and the Ayatollahs are gone and Iran's a free country. But most of what their energy is, and people talk about this, they may not have the energy or the military might to actually combat what's happening with them, but they may be organizing their troops to kill anyone who tries to, foment an uprising. And that is what typically authoritarian regimes, they worry about the exterior, but they worry even more about their interior.
Yeah, and I was promised from the neocons that as soon as this started to happen, there'd be millions of people in the streets demanding regime change and demanding the Ayatollah's head. That hasn't happened yet.
Well, we come together. Look, in our country, Republican and Democrat, we fight all the time, fiercely over things. But the moment someone attacks us, after 9/11, we all came together. We came together as a people. Anytime we have ever been attacked, we've come together. Mm-hmm. And, before World War II, there was a lot of resistance to getting involved in Europe's war. But then once we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, the whole country came together. So I think you can make this argument that the same may happen in Iran, that they'll forget their differences, they'll forget how bad the mullahs are, and they may rally behind their flag. But the future's unknown, and it needs to at least be explored as a possibility that things could be worse, not better after all of this.
Yeah, sometimes I find myself annoyed with the phrase peace through strength because I think the neocons have so badly abused it. The Reaganism, rather than focusing on the ism and not the man of Reagan, I think they've so badly abused it.
They should change it. For the neocons, it would be peace through dollars. Yeah. Peace through defense contracts, peace through the military-industrial complex. But peace through strength, can be a reasonable thing to aspire to. But for the neocons, it's all about dollars. I mean, it's like, the border bill that we're doing now, it's really not a border bill. It's a military subsidy bill. They're trying to bust more of the military caps and funnel more money into the military. And they will, about $150 billion on top of a 3% increase in the military last year.
Yeah, peace through strength is not peace through war. And so many people use it as peace through war. Senator Rand Paul, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sit Down.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.